What you're about to hear will shock you to your core. A 911 call that would expose the deadly secret behind America's most wholesome family.
What's that? What's the emergency?
When police arrived at this remote Ohio farmhouse, they thought they were responding to a routine welfare check. What they found instead was a blood-soaked crime scene that would haunt investigators for years.
Upon arrival at the residence, the deputies noticed that the front door was open. As they approached the house, they seen what they believed to be someone laying on the floor. They gave verbal commands. There was no response. And at that time, there was a gunshot that went off.
Then they heard it. A single gunshot echoing through the house. Inside, they would discover the brutal murders of a devoted Christian mother and her youngest son. The killer? Her own child, a 26-year-old musical prodigy who had charmed millions of TV viewers just 9 years earlier. This is the story of how reality television may have triggered one of the most shocking family massacres in American history. A story of secrets, control, and the deadly price of perfection. This is the Stockdale Family Massacre, Beach City, Ohio. Population 1,200. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, where church bells mark Sunday morning, and where the most exciting event is usually the high school homecoming game. But on June 15, 2017, this quiet farming community would become the setting for a nightmare so horrific, it would make national headlines and leave investigators asking one terrifying question. What could drive a seemingly perfect son to murder his own family in cold blood? To understand what happened that bloody Thursday afternoon, we need to go back 9 years, to when America fell in love with what they believed was the most wholesome family on television.
We moved out to the farm to develop wholesome values in our children.
The day we moved, we heard gunshots in our neighborhood, and I knew we had made the right decision.
The year was 2008. Reality TV was king, and ABC's Wife Swap was one of the most popular shows on television. The premise was simple but explosive. Take two families with completely opposite lifestyles, swap their mothers for 2 weeks, and watch the drama unfold. But when producers stumbled upon the Stockdale family of rural Ohio, they knew they had struck television gold. Here was a family so devoted to their Christian faith, so committed to traditional values, that they had completely cut themselves off from the modern world. What millions of viewers saw was a heartwarming story of family values and musical talent. What they didn't see was the dark truth lurking beneath the surface, a truth that would eventually explode in the most violent way possible. The Stockdales weren't just strict, they were something far more sinister. Tim and Kathy Stockdale had created what can only be described as a prison disguised as paradise. On their 53-acre farm in Beach City, the Stockdales raised their 4 sons, Calvin, Charles, Jacob, and James, according to rules so extreme they bordered on abuse. The boys were forbidden from watching TV, playing video games, listening to modern music, or even talking to girls. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The boys weren't just isolated from the outside world. They were psychologically controlled through a twisted system of rewards and punishments that would make a cult leader proud. Every morning, the boys had exactly 4 minutes to get dressed and reach the breakfast table. Any lateness resulted in fines. They were forced to complete hours of farm chores. But here's the sick part. They had to do it with what their mother called a glad heart. Showing any negative emotion resulted in punishment. And the rewards? For hours of back-breaking labor and complete obedience, the boys could earn tokens, literal tokens, that they could exchange for basic privileges that most children consider rights. Things like listening to a pre-approved radio show, but perhaps most disturbing of all was the family's musical talent. Jacob Stockdale wasn't just good at the fiddle, he was a prodigy. By age 7, he could play like a master. By his teens, he was winning competitions across Ohio.
Oh my God, I'm in the bottom of a river sheet. When the whistle blows, I gotta go. Well, mama, oh, well, it looks like a freight train.
This wasn't just a hobby. It was Jacob's only source of identity, his only claim to individual worth in a family system designed to crush individuality. And that musical gift would eventually become both his salvation and his curse. Because what the Stockdales didn't realize was that their perfect parenting was creating a psychological time bomb. And Jacob Stockdale was the one holding the detonator. In 2007, the Stockdale family received a phone call that would change their lives forever and set in motion a chain of events that would end in blood. A producer from Wife Swap had somehow discovered their isolated lifestyle and wanted them on the show. For a family that had spent decades hiding from the modern world, it was an impossible decision. But there was something the producers didn't know, something that would make this episode of Wife Swap unlike any other in the show's history. The boys, especially Jacob and James, were desperate to participate. For the first time in their lives, they saw a chance to show the world that they existed, that their family was special. After months of prayer and deliberation, Tim and Kathy agreed. They thought they could use national television to prove their lifestyle was superior. They had no idea they were about to expose their sons to knowledge that would eventually destroy their family. The producers paired the ultra-conservative Stockdales with their polar opposite, the Tonkovic family from Illinois. If the Stockdales were a military boot camp, the Tonkovics were a free-for-all. When Lori Tonkovic arrived at the Stockdale farm, she was immediately horrified by what she found. The family rules Kathy had prepared for her read like a prisoner's manual. But it wasn't just the rules. It was the atmosphere of fear that permeated every corner of that house. She watched 16-year-old Jacob break down in tears at the thought of watching television. Genuinely terrified, he would go to hell for such a simple act. And then Lori did something that would haunt the Stockdale family forever. She gave the boys a taste of freedom. She installed cable TV, brought in video games, and for the first time in their lives, the Stockdale boys experienced what it was like to just be normal kids. Jacob's reaction was the most disturbing. When encouraged to watch TV, he fled the room in panic. When Lori tried to explain there was nothing sinful about harmless entertainment, he covered his ears and began reciting Bible verses.
Video?
Yeah.
Who picks those?
Mom does.
Oh, this is great.
This is 100 tokens, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay with you?
I would rather not have to do the tokens to get like the radio show.
But something had been awakened in these boys, a realization that there were other ways to live, other ways to be a family. And that knowledge would eventually prove deadly. The episode aired on April 23, 2008, to millions of viewers. America was simultaneously fascinated and horrified. Some praised the parents' dedication to traditional values. Others saw something much darker, psychological abuse disguised as religious devotion. But perhaps the most chilling response came from viewers who predicted that such extreme control would eventually lead to rebellion or worse. One comment read, "These boys are going to explode someday, and when they do, it's going to be violent." They had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Following their TV appearance, cracks began to form in the Stockdales' carefully constructed world. And those cracks would eventually become the fault lines that would tear their family apart. Calvin, the eldest son, was the first to escape. In 2009, he left for college in Michigan, thousands of miles from his parents' influence. For the first time, he discovered that you could be a devout Christian without living in constant fear. Charles followed in 2010, heading to Philadelphia for medical school. Like his brother, he found that the outside world wasn't the hellscape their parents had described. But here's what's truly chilling. Both boys chose colleges thousands of miles away. They weren't just going to school, they were running for their lives. This left Jacob and James alone with their increasingly desperate parents. Tim and Kathy had lost half their children to the secular world they'd fought so hard to avoid. And their response would prove catastrophic. Instead of loosening their grip, they tightened it. More rules, more restrictions, more control. But Jacob, now in his 20s, was beginning to crack under the pressure. The young man who had once dazzled audiences with his fiddle was slowly disintegrating. Friends and family members later reported disturbing changes in Jacob's behavior. He would play his fiddle obsessively, sometimes the same passages for hours. The music itself became darker, more discordant, as if he was working through internal demons through his instrument. When he wasn't playing, he would sit in complete silence, staring blankly at walls. Family conversations became one-sided affairs, with Jacob offering little more than grunts or brief responses. James, still living at home while attending college, became increasingly worried about his older brother. He confided to friends that Jacob seemed to be fighting demons, a phrase that in the deeply religious Stockdale household carried both literal and metaphorical weight. But the most disturbing sign? Jacob had begun talking to himself, sometimes conducting entire conversations with invisible participants. The family who had spent decades protecting themselves from outside influences were about to discover that the greatest threat had been growing inside their home all along. In the final months of 2016 and early 2017, those closest to Jacob Stockdale began to notice changes that should have served as red flags. But in a family trained to ignore problems and pray them away, these warning signs were missed.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Jacob's relationship with his fiddle, the instrument that had defined his entire identity, became obsessive and disturbing. Family members reported hearing him play the same dark passages over and over again, sometimes through the entire night. He began experiencing panic attacks during performances, sometimes having to flee the stage mid-song. He stopped maintaining his personal hygiene, often going days without bathing or changing clothes. Most terrifying of all, he started making cryptic comments about ending the suffering and finding peace. But Tim and Kathy, isolated by decades of avoiding outside intervention, interpreted their son's breakdown through a spiritual lens. Jacob wasn't mentally ill. He was under spiritual attack. The solution wasn't professional help, but more prayer, more faith, and, ironically, more control. It was exactly the wrong response at exactly the wrong time. James later told investigators that in the weeks before the murders, Jacob had begun expressing feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. But most chilling of all, Jacob had started making comments suggesting he didn't want James to experience the same suffering he was enduring. He spoke about protecting his younger brother from the pain of living in their family system. Comments that James initially interpreted as brotherly concern rather than homicidal ideation. The weekend before the murders, the family attended a bluegrass festival. Witnesses reported Jacob's behavior as noticeably erratic. He seemed disoriented during their performance, playing off-key and struggling to follow the rhythm. During their set break, several people reported seeing him talking animatedly to himself while pacing behind stage. After the performance, Jacob made a comment to his father that would haunt Tim for the rest of his life. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay, Dad. Something has to change." Tim, focused on packing up equipment, didn't pursue the conversation. It was the last meaningful exchange between father and son. On June 14th, 2017, just one day before the murders, Jacob and James recorded what would be their final video together. A rendition of the song posted to the family's YouTube channel. You'd think at 21 years old, I'd be ready to grow up and join adulthood. Nothing for me. Is there a third option? I wish there was a third option. Those words, "Is there a third option?" would prove prophetic in the most horrific way possible. Because the next day, Jacob Stockdale would find his third option, and it would be written in blood. June 15th, 2017, 4:30 p.m. On the surface, it was just another quiet Thursday afternoon at the Stockdale farm. Tim had left earlier to run errands in town, leaving Kathy, Jacob, and James alone on the property. It was a situation that had occurred thousands of times before without incident. But this time would be different. This time, the psychological time bomb that had been building for 26 years was finally about to explode. According to the timeline investigators later reconstructed, Jacob retrieved a shotgun from the family's gun cabinet sometime around 4 p.m. The same guns that had been used for years to hunt and control farm pests would now be turned on his own family. He found his mother Kathy and brother James together in an upstairs bathroom. What happened next would take less than 5 minutes, but would shatter two families forever. Jacob shot both victims at close range, killing them instantly. The woman who had controlled every aspect of his life for 26 years. The brother he claimed he was trying to protect from suffering. Then, at 4:36 p.m., Jacob did something that investigators still can't fully explain. He called 911. The call lasted only seconds before Jacob hung up. Was a cry for help? A moment of regret? Or simply part of his plan to ensure his own suicide would be witnessed? We may never know, because when Starr County deputies arrived at the scene, they found a front door standing wide open, an ominous sign in a community where people rarely locked their doors. As they approached the house, they could see what they believed to be someone laying on the floor. They gave verbal commands. There was no response. And then they heard it. Officers rushed inside to find Jacob Stockdale, bleeding from a devastating head wound, a shotgun beside him, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Deeper in the house, they discovered the bodies of Kathy and James Stockdale, both killed by shotgun blasts to the head. The scene told a horrific story. Jacob had murdered his mother and younger brother, then attempted to take his own life in what appeared to be a planned murder-suicide that had gone partially wrong. As paramedics worked frantically to save Jacob's life, investigators began the grim task of trying to understand how America's most wholesome family had become the site of such horrific violence. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come, because when they searched Jacob's room, they found no suicide note, no manifesto, no explanation for his actions. The young man who had committed these crimes remained as much of an enigma after his arrest as he had been before. And that mystery would haunt investigators and his surviving family members for years to come. Jacob Stockdale's survival meant that the community would be denied the closure that often comes with a completed murder-suicide. Instead, they were left with the disturbing knowledge that a family annihilator was among them, wounded and hospitalized, but very much alive. At Cleveland Metro Health Medical Center, Jacob fought for his life as doctors worked to repair the devastating damage he had inflicted upon himself. The shotgun blast had caused severe brain trauma, destroyed vision in his left eye, and left him in a medically induced coma for weeks. Meanwhile, Tim Stockdale faced an unimaginable reality. He had lost his wife and youngest son, while his third son lay dying in a hospital bed as the prime suspect in their murders. The man who had devoted his life to protecting his family from outside harm now had to confront the truth that the greatest threat had come from within. In a move that shocked the community, Tim and his surviving sons Calvin and Charles did something that seemed impossible to understand. They forgave Jacob. Not only did they forgive him, but when the legal proceedings began, they actively advocated for leniency. They begged the court to see Jacob not as a monster, but as another victim of circumstances beyond his control. The legal process would drag on for years. Jacob's defense team argued that the brain damage from his suicide attempt made him incompetent to stand trial. Prosecutors countered that he had retained enough mental capacity to plan and execute the murders. During his evaluation at a mental health facility, Jacob made 2 escape attempts that prove he still possessed the cunning to plan and deceive. The first involved hiding behind books during a shift change. The weekend before the murders, the family attended a bluegrass festival. Witnesses reported Jacob's behavior as noticeably erratic. He seemed disoriented during their performance, playing off-key and struggling to follow the rhythm. During their set break, several people reported seeing him talking animatedly to himself while pacing behind stage. After the performance, Jacob made a comment to his father that would haunt Tim for the rest of his life. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay, Dad. Something has to change." Tim, focused on packing up equipment, didn't pursue the conversation. It was the last meaningful exchange between father and son. On June 14th, 2017, just one day before the murders, Jacob and James recorded what would be their final video together. A rendition of the song posted to the family's YouTube channel. You'd think at 21 years old, I'd be ready to grow up and join adulthood. Nothing for me. Is there a third option? I wish there was a third option. Those words, "Is there a third option?" would prove prophetic in the most horrific way possible. Because the next day, Jacob Stockdale would find his third option, and it would be written in blood. June 15th, 2017, 4:30 p.m. On the surface, it was just another quiet Thursday afternoon at the Stockdale farm. Tim had left earlier to run errands in town, leaving Kathy, Jacob, and James alone on the property. It was a situation that had occurred thousands of times before without incident. But this time would be different. This time, the psychological time bomb that had been building for 26 years was finally about to explode. According to the timeline investigators later reconstructed, Jacob retrieved a shotgun from the family's gun cabinet sometime around 4 p.m. The same guns that had been used for years to hunt and control farm pests would now be turned on his own family. Over mental health. The most tragic irony is that Tim and Kathy Stockdale genuinely believed they were protecting their children. They thought that by isolating them from the world, they could preserve their innocence and ensure their salvation. Instead, they created a pressure cooker that eventually exploded with devastating consequences. The Stockdale case serves as a chilling reminder that the families that appear most perfect on the surface are often the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And sometimes, those secrets don't stay buried forever. Today, Calvin and Charles Stockdale have built successful lives far from the shadow of their upbringing. They've forgiven their brother, maintained their faith, and somehow found peace despite the tragedy that destroyed their family. Tim Stockdale continues to live on the family farm, alone now, except for memories and the haunting question of what he could have done differently. And Jacob? Jacob remains locked away, serving his sentence for crimes that shocked a nation. The musical prodigy who once brought audiences to tears with his fiddle now spends his days in a prison cell, a living reminder of what happens when the pursuit of perfection becomes a deadly obsession. The Stockdale family thought they could create paradise by controlling every aspect of their children's lives. Instead, they created hell on earth, a hell that eventually consumed them all. This has been the story of the Stockdale family murders, a tragedy that began with the best of intentions and ended with the worst possible outcome. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build ourselves, and sometimes the only escape is violence. Thank you for watching. If this case affected you as much as it affected us, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark side of seemingly perfect families.